It's early morning, 6:47 a.m., March 12th, 2024. The sun's barely peeking over the Oklahoma plains as three unmarked police cars quietly roll down Maple Street in the tiny town of Goldtree. It's the kind of place where you can walk from one end to the other in 15 minutes flat. Curtains twitch. Mrs. Patterson, already up making her morning coffee, pauses mid-pour as officers in tactical vests step out and approach a modest ranch-style home with faded blue shutters. She knows that house. Everybody in Goldtree does. When the front door opens and the man inside is led away in handcuffs, the sight feels almost unreal. This isn't some stranger. It's someone the town's known for decades. A familiar face from Sunday potlucks. A guy who waved at kids walking to school, who pumped gas at the corner station. A man who'd lived quietly among them, while an entire community spent 38 long years haunted by one question: what happened to Beatrice Rowan? Beatrice was the town librarian who one day just vanished without a trace in October of 1986. Her car had been found in the library parking lot, keys still in the ignition. Later, her scattered belongings were discovered in the woods, but never her body. Goldtree carried that weight for almost 4 decades. Parents began locking their doors for the first time. Kids were told not to stray too far after dark. Every fall, when the leaves began to turn, whispers of Beatrice's name would drift through the town again. Would they ever know the truth? Then in 2024, thanks to new advances in DNA technology and the tireless determination of investigators, this cold case finally cracked wide open. And what they found didn't just solve a mystery, it tore apart all that this small town thought it knew of that October night in '86. But before we dive into who was arrested, how the evidence from decades ago finally pointed to a suspect hiding in plain sight, and the jaw-dropping revelations that came out in the interrogation room, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And because what you're going to hear is one of the most astonishing cold case breakthroughs I have ever covered. Below is the complete story of Beatrice Rowan's disappearance, the limitations of 1980s forensics, the families who never gave up, and the March morning that finally brought justice after 38 years of silence. But to fully understand how we got to this point, we need to travel back to where it started. Goldtree, Oklahoma, 1986. This wasn't the kind of place where bad things happened. With less than 300 residents, it was the picture of small-town America. Main Street had a post office, a grain elevator, a cozy little diner called Rosie's, where everybody knew your usual order, in the Goldtree Public Library, a modest brick building which proudly stood since 1952. It was a town where residents left doors unlocked, kids rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, and Friday night football brought nearly everyone out to cheer. On Sunday mornings, church pews were full. Here, neighbors weren't just neighbors, they were family, and at the heart of that family was Beatrice Rowan. By the way, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories are reaching. Beatrice was 32 that fall, but she had one of those faces in which it was impossible to tell if she was 25 or 40. She had been head librarian at Goldtree Public Library for 7 years, taking over after the beloved Mrs. Henderson retired. If you'd grown up in Goldtree during the '80s, you knew Beatrice. She was the one who helped you find that perfect book for your school report, even if it meant calling around to libraries in neighboring towns. Every summer, she organized the reading program herself, complete with hand-drawn certificates and small prizes she often paid for out of her own pocket. She knew every child by name and remembered what books they liked. She somehow always managed to recommend just exactly what you needed, even before you knew it yourself. She just had that kind of gift, pausing for effect, and that's what made her disappearance all the more unthinkable. As one former library regular once said, she made you feel like you mattered, like every person who walked in was important. That was Beatrice, kind, thoughtful, and genuinely invested in her little corner of the world. She'd grown up about 30 miles south in Enid, Oklahoma, before moving to Goldtree after graduating from the University of Central Oklahoma with a degree in library science. Her home was a small, one-bedroom apartment right above the hardware store on Main Street, a cozy place with plants crowding every windowsill, books stacked on every surface. Her younger sister, Margaret, still lived in Enid with their parents, and Beatrice would drive down most Sundays for family dinner. She wasn't married, though she dated here and there over the years. Nothing serious had ever stuck. But those who knew her said she seemed perfectly content. She had her books, her library, her Friday night bowling league, and a close circle of friends who adored her. Each morning, Beatrice's routine was as steady as the sunrise. She'd arrive around 8:30 a.m., a full half hour before the library opened, carrying a thermos of coffee in one hand and a brown paper lunch bag in the other. She'd unlock those old wooden doors, flip on the lights, and start her day, checking in returned books, filing cards in the catalog drawers, shelving new arrivals, and getting everything ready for her visitors. This was the pre-computer era, when everything was handwritten, stamped, and organized by touch and memory. But in Goldtree, the library wasn't just about books. It was the gathering spot. Elderly residents came to read the newspaper and chat about town gossip. Teenagers worked on their homework at the big tables by the windows. Young moms brought their little ones for Wednesday morning story time, a program Beatrice herself had started. And she didn't just read those stories. She performed them. One mom still laughs when remembering Beatrice's version of The Three Little Pigs. She did all the voices: the pigs, the wolf, even the sound effects. At the end of the session, the kids were doubled over in giggles. Then came Tuesday, October 14th, 1986. It was one of those days that started out like all the others. Beatrice was dressed in a cream-colored cardigan over a floral dress, her brown leather flats softly clicking against the tile floors. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail. Her sister Margaret would later describe that outfit to police in heartbreaking detail. That morning, she waved to Ray Hutchins as he opened the hardware store below her apartment. At noon, she chatted with the mailman. In the afternoon, she helped a group of high school students dig through history books for a class project. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, nothing at all. To all who saw her that day, Beatrice was her usual self, cheerful, patient, that warm smile never far from her face. She reminded a young boy that his copy of Where the Red Fern Grows was due back on Friday. She logged 17 patrons in her daily record book. She even ordered 3 new titles from the county library system before closing up for the night. The last confirmed sighting of Beatrice was about 6:30 p.m. The library closed at 6 on weeknights. A few townspeople later recalled seeing her lock up, lights flicking off one by one inside. Deputy Frank Morrison passed by on patrol and waved. Mr. Chen, who ran the grocery store down the street, remembered her calling out a cheerful, "Good night," as he swept his front steps. And after that, nothing. She was gone. October 1986 turned out to be the month that altered Goldtree forever. The month neighbors started eyeing each other differently, when fear crept into a town that hitherto felt safe. It was the month when the library, once a place of warmth and laughter, became associated with heartbreak and questions left unanswered. None could have predicted that as the sun set over the Oklahoma plains that Tuesday evening, and Beatrice Rowan locked those doors for the last time, a decades-long nightmare was just beginning. Wednesday, October 15th, began like any other. Carol Jensen, Beatrice's assistant who worked 3 days a week, pulled into the parking lot at 8:55 a.m., just 5 minutes before opening. She expected to see Beatrice's car already parked in its usual spot, a light blue 1982 Ford Escort with a small dent in the rear bumper, a souvenir from when she'd accidentally backed into a mailbox the summer before. Beatrice was always early. That's why when Carol Jensen pulled into the parking lot and saw Beatrice's light blue Ford Escort already there, but the library still dark and locked, it immediately sent a chill through her. The lights were off. The desk calendar inside still showed the Tuesday, October 14th page. Carol knocked on the door, waited, knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Something wasn't right. She circled around back to where Beatrice usually parked, and sure enough, the car was there. But the driver's side door was unlocked. The keys were still sitting in the ignition. The passenger seat held a brown leather purse belonging to Beatrice, the top flopping open, wallet plainly in view. A copy of Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurtry lay on the dashboard, as if she had just set it down for a minute with the intention of returning immediately. Carol's stomach dropped. She quickened her pace down the street to the payphone outside the post office and called the sheriff's department. Then she tried Beatrice's apartment. 8 rings, no answer. Finally, she dialed Beatrice's parents in Enid. Dorothy Rowan picked up on the second ring. "Mrs. Rowan, this is Carol from the library. I'm so sorry to bother you, but have you heard from Beatrice this morning?" There was a pause, then Dorothy's voice came back, uneasy. "No, honey." "Why? Is everything all right?" Carol hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She's not here at the library, but her car is. I'm sure it's nothing, but I wanted to check if maybe she mentioned coming to see you." "She was supposed to call me last night," Dorothy said, her tone tightening. "We were planning Sunday dinner." "She never called." "I just thought she got busy by 9:30 a.m. Sheriff Tom Bradford was standing beside Beatrice's car, scanning the scene with that quiet, methodical concern that comes from decades on the job. A small crowd had gathered. Carol, Dorothy, and half the town, it seemed. In a place as small as Goldtree, news like this spread faster than a prairie fire. Sheriff Bradford had worked in law enforcement for over 30 years, but these cases usually consisted of rowdy bar fights or teenagers tipping cows, not a missing librarian. He gingerly opened the car door, watching out for fingerprints. Keys were in the ignition. Her purse was still in the car and untouched. Wallet inside with cash and credit card still there. No broken glass, no blood, no signs of struggle. The car was clean and orderly, just like everything in Beatrice's life. "When's the last time anyone saw her?" he asked. Deputy Frank Morrison stepped forward. "I saw her locking up the library around 6:30 last night. Waved at her as I drove by." She waved back. Everything seemed normal. "Anyone see her after that?" Bradford asked. Heads shook. Murmurs of no rippled through the small crowd. Bradford made his decision. "Frank, call the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Then I want every available person searching this town. Carol, I'll need you to walk through the library with me. See if anything feels out of place." What they found inside only deepened the mystery. Everything was just as Beatrice would have left it. Books were neatly shelved, the card catalog organized down to the letter. Her daily log was fully filled out. The last entry marked a 6 p.m. closing time, signed BR. Her coffee thermos had been washed and was drying on the counter. The cash register was balanced to the penny. The day's small earnings logged carefully in her neat handwriting. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. It was as if she'd locked up, walked outside, and simply vanished. That afternoon, more than 100 volunteers were combing through Goldtree in the countryside. They searched Main Street, alleys, the grain elevator, even the abandoned railway depot on the outskirts of town. They searched the abandoned Thornton farm, calling out her name until their voices were hoarse. Beatrice's sister Margaret from Enid arrived before dark, her face pale, eyes red from crying. "This isn't like her," she kept saying over and over. "Beatrice wouldn't just leave. She wouldn't leave her car. Something's wrong. Something's really wrong. Just more questions." And a growing, bone-deep dread that something terrible had happened to their librarian, the woman who'd been the heart of their town. They were combing through a wooded area about 3 miles northeast of town, just past the old county road that hadn't seen much traffic in years. The trees there were thick oak and cottonwood mostly, and the ground was blanketed with leaves and brush. He stepped closer. It was a cardigan, torn, muddy, with leaves stuck to it. Beatrice's cardigan, the same one she'd been wearing when she was last seen. The sleeve of one was almost torn off at the shoulder. But no Beatrice. No body. There was no indication of what had happened in those woods. Torn clothes, scattered belongings, the isolation of the site, all spoke to violence, to struggle, to desperation. Without the body, without witnesses, and without solid evidence, investigators had little more than haunting questions. By Friday, October 17th, the story had broken across Oklahoma. Reporters from Enid and Oklahoma City flooded the quiet streets of Goldtree. Camera crews filmed outside the library, panned across the empty parking lot, and trudged through the woods where her belongings were found. That night, Dorothy and Margaret Rowan appeared on television, faces drawn with grief but full of hope. They prayed for a miracle. But as October slipped into November and the nights grew colder, Most people quietly reached the same painful conclusion. Beatrice Rowan wasn't coming home. Within 48 hours, the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation took over. They brought in manpower, equipment, and expertise that Goldtree simply didn't have. Physical evidence was almost non-existent. Beatrice's Ford Escort had been processed top to bottom, fingerprints lifted, fibers collected, every inch photographed. But it didn't yield a single solid lead. The lab results came back, and they were frustratingly ordinary. Every fingerprint found inside Beatrice's car belonged either to her or her friend Carol Jensen, or a few library patrons who'd caught rides with her before. No mystery prints, no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no forced entry. Just a perfectly ordinary car belonging to a woman who had vanished without a trace. Next came Beatrice's friends and co-workers at the library. Again, nothing suspicious. Everybody had a routine, and none of them matched up with the critical window when Beatrice disappeared. First was Dennis Kowalski, a 41-year-old mechanic known around town for being friendly, sometimes a little too friendly. He'd asked Beatrice out several times over the previous year, and she'd always declined with firm politeness. Some said Dennis didn't take rejection well. On the night of October 14th, he'd been drinking at a bar on Main Street. He claimed he was there from 7 p.m. until closing time, around midnight. The bartender remembered seeing him, but couldn't pin down exactly when he'd arrived. Then there was Robert Keller, a quiet 33-year-old who worked at the grain elevator and lived on the outskirts of town. He was one of those people everyone knew of, but few really knew. A regular at the library, he often stopped by to check out books about engines or small-town history. A few locals mentioned he acted a bit awkward around Beatrice. Maybe shy, maybe something else. But no one could recall anything overtly concerning. When detectives questioned him, Keller said he'd been home the night she vanished, working on his truck. His elderly mother, who lived with him, confirmed his story. He came off as calm and cooperative. His name went into the file, but there was nothing to hold him on. Detective Walsh's team conducted over 200 interviews in those first few months. They ran polygraph tests on several men. Some passed, some were inconclusive. None pointed to guilt. They searched homes, barns, vehicles, and sheds. Every lead seemed to end in the same frustrating place: nowhere. And that question, unanswered and unbearable, would haunt her for decades. Pause. A long-haul truck driver reported seeing a woman who looked a lot like Beatrice walking along County Road 47, not far from where her belongings would later be found. It was around 7 p.m. on October 14th, the night she disappeared. He said she was wearing light-colored clothing, but he hadn't stopped and his memory was fuzzy. When investigators showed him a photo of Beatrice, he squinted and said, "Maybe, but I can't be sure." It wasn't much, but for a while, it was something to hold on to. The search around those woods continued for weeks. Cadaver dogs combed through thick brush, circling out wider and wider. Volunteers trudged through mud and cold, refusing to give up. They dragged ponds, checked abandoned wells, and explored every half-collapsed barn or forgotten cellar within miles. Still, nothing. As October gave way to November and then December, the search efforts slowly lost momentum. The OSBI team packed up its temporary headquarters and returned to Oklahoma City. They left behind a thick case file, a few boxes of evidence, and a promise to follow up on any new leads. Detective Walsh gave his word to the Rowan family. He wasn't giving up. The case would stay open. Still, everyone knew what those words really meant. Without fresh evidence, Beatrice's case was slipping into the cold shadows where unsolved mysteries live. By the first anniversary of her disappearance, October 1987, the investigation had reached a complete standstill. Every lead was exhausted. Every theory was tested. Officially, the case would remain open, but nobody was actively working it anymore. Galry tried to move forward, but something in the town had shifted. The library was quiet now. There was a diminishment in people smiling. The real community warmth felt replaced by unease. And somewhere out there, someone who knew precisely what happened that night was still free and living his life as if nothing had happened. Turns out time does not heal all wounds. Sometimes it just teaches you how to carry them. The years that followed were filled with hope and heartbreak for Dorothy and Margaret Rowan. Every phone call brought a flicker of possibility. Every knock at the door made Dorothy's heart skip. And every October 14th, year after year, was a wound reopened. Dorothy never changed Beatrice's bedroom. The floral bedspread remained just the same, the shelf still lined with her old paperbacks. On the nightstand, a framed photo of Beatrice beaming in her cap and gown from college. Dorothy would dust the room, straighten the pillows, and whisper, "Just in case you come home." She knew deep down that her daughter wasn't coming back, but sometimes hope, even fragile hope, is the only thing that keeps a heart beating. Margaret coped differently. She poured herself into advocacy, becoming a leading voice for missing persons in Oklahoma. She spoke at town halls, attended support groups, and urged law enforcement not to let cold cases fade into silence. She had, every year, conducted a vigil in Galway on October 14th. The autumn wind would whip candles into a flickering dance as the people gathered to remember Beatrice. Standing before them, Margaret's voice would break, but her message stayed firm. Gentle pause. "By the way, what time is it where you are? Let me know down in the comments." Because for the Rowans, time had stopped the night Beatrice vanished. And the town of Galway, it would never be the same again. The doors that once stayed unlocked now had deadbolts. Parents who once let their kids roam freely now kept them close, eyes always scanning the street. That old sense of small-town safety was gone, replaced by suspicion. Neighbors eyed one another differently now, whispering questions no one dared say out loud. The question became, who could be trusted? Inside the box was a snapshot of 1986. Brown paper evidence bags sealed with brittle tape, handwritten tags yellowed with age, and photographs clipped together with rusted paper fasteners. Each item was a piece of a story frozen in time. The torn cardigan, the single muddy shoe, the cracked library ID badge, the wristwatch with its broken band. For almost 4 decades, these were silent objects. Now, through modern forensic science, they finally had the opportunity to speak. Carefully, Detective Sarah Mendoza repackaged the cardigan and sent it to a state-of-the-art DNA lab in Quantico, along with a detailed report including the chain of custody, all the environmental conditions, and every other known fact about the case. The lab analysts promised to run new generation testing capable of detecting even the most faint biological trace, such as skin cells, sweat, or touch DNA, something unimaginable in 1986. Then came the waiting. She had checked her email obsessively for months, waking up in the middle of the night just to refresh her inbox. The Rowan case had consumed her. She'd studied the old interviews, listened to the faded cassette recordings of Sheriff Bradford's voice, reviewed the blurry photographs taken in the woods. Every detail had become part of her memory. "Detective Mendoza," said the lab technician over the phone, his voice even but charged. "We got something." The cardigan had yielded a partial male DNA profile. Not a full sequence, but enough to upload into CODIS, the National DNA Database. For nearly 4 decades, that system hadn't existed. Now it was the key that could unlock everything. It was a familial match, which means it wasn't direct, but close. The profile matched the son of a man by the name of Robert Keller. Same Robert Keller who'd been questioned in 1986. The quiet man from the grain elevator, the one who'd lived on the outskirts of town. Mendoza's heart was racing as she pulled the old file on Keller. It all came flooding back. His alibi from his mother, the lack of physical evidence against him, how he'd been quietly dropped as a suspect after passing a polygraph. But now, almost 4 decades later, his DNA, left on Beatrice's torn cardigan, had tied him back to the crime. The next steps came swiftly. With the assistance of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, Mendoza acquired a DNA warrant for Keller. He was 70 years now, living in Wichita, Kansas, off the radar, retired, no criminal record, a grandfather. Agents came to his door on the pretext of a routine follow-up. Keller, courteous but guarded, invited them in and offered them coffee. Then he was asked whether he would provide a DNA sample to help eliminate confusion. He hesitated, then agreed. 2 weeks later, the results were in, a perfect match. Robert Keller's DNA matched the biological material found on Beatrice Rowan's cardigan. There was no mistake. No doubt whatsoever. After 38 years, Galway's nightmare had been named. Robert Keller was arrested without incident at his residence on March 12, 2024. As agents placed handcuffs around his wrists, All he said in response to his predicament was, "I knew this day would come." News flew fast back in Galway. For the elders, this was a shock that hit deep. Keller had lived among them for decades, even volunteered at local events, attended church, waved at neighbors from his porch. That he had been the one all along shook the town of its core. "Margaret," Mendoza said quietly, "we got him." For several seconds, Margaret couldn't speak. Then she began to cry. Not the tears of fresh grief, but the kind that come when a wound that's festered for decades finally starts to close. "Thank you," she whispered through sobs. "You brought her home." Keller eventually confessed during interrogation. His words were chillingly calm. He told investigators he'd just wanted to talk to Beatrice that night, that she'd rebuffed his advances, that he'd lost control. He'd attacked her near her car, dragged her into his truck, and driven her out toward the woods. He refused to say where he'd left her body. Despite extensive renewed searches guided by his vague directions, the remains of Beatrice were never found. But under Oklahoma law, the forensic evidence, confession, and corroborating details were enough. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Asked if she had forgiven him, Margaret said quietly, "Forgiveness isn't mine to give. I just wanted the truth." For Detective Mendoza, the case became a defining moment in her career, a testament to perseverance, science, and the power of never giving up. "Cold doesn't mean forgotten," she said at a press conference. "Every piece of evidence tells a story. Sometimes it just takes time for the science to catch up." Today, a plaque hangs in the Galway Public Library near the front desk, where Beatrice once greeted patrons with a smile. It reads, "Inside that old evidence box lay the pieces of a mystery frozen in time. Artifacts that had waited nearly 4 decades for science to finally catch up." There it was, Beatrice Rowan's torn, cream-colored cardigan, sealed neatly in plastic, her broken wristwatch, the library ID badge she wore every day. Each item had been cataloged and stored by 1986 standards, and miraculously, those procedures had preserved what might now be the key to the truth. In January 2024, Detective Sarah Mendoza sent the cardigan to Orchid Cellmark, a forensic lab in Texas known for breathing new life into cold cases. They specialized in pulling usable DNA from evidence so old it had seemed hopeless for years. Dr. Patricia Vance, the lead forensic scientist on the case, studied the cardigan under high-powered magnification. The fabric told a grim story. Torn seams, stretched fibers, faint stains that hinted at a violent struggle. But what really caught Dr. Vance's attention were specific spots: the collar, the inside of the sleeves, the very places an attacker might have gripped during a fight. "We're looking for touch DNA," she told Mendoza over the phone. "Even a few skin cells left behind during a struggle can tell us who was there." In 1986, that concept was science fiction. In 2024, it was a lifeline. It took several weeks. The lab used the latest technology to take samples from several areas of the cardigan. Most yielded nothing. Decades of decay erased so much of what was once there. But from one spot near that torn right sleeve, they got something: a viable DNA profile. It was male. It didn't belong to anyone in Beatrice's family, her co-workers, or any of the people who'd been questioned back in the day. This was the attacker. When the call came in early February, Detective Mendoza's hands shook. A genetic fingerprint, the silent witness to Beatrice's last moments, finally belonged to them 38 long years later. But that victory was only half the battle. They had a profile, yes, but not a name. The sample was uploaded into CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, a system filled with millions of profiles from convicted criminals. Mendoza waited anxiously for the computer to do its work. Then the screen flashed back. No match found. Whoever had done this either had never been caught for another serious crime or had managed to stay invisible for nearly 4 decades. But Detective Mendoza wasn't about to stop there. That's when she turned to a tool that had rewritten the rulebook on cold cases: genetic genealogy. She contacted Parabon Nanolabs, one of the top companies pioneering this method, the very people who identified the Golden State Killer. The idea was both brilliant and very personal. Upload the DNA profile on public genealogy sites like GEDmatch, find distant relatives, then trace the family trees until you land on one person who fits the puzzle. C.C. Moore is one of the most respected forensic genealogists in the country, and she took on Beatrice's case personally. Every case is like a massive puzzle, she said. You're not just looking at DNA. You're rebuilding an entire family history, sometimes going back centuries to find one person who shouldn't be there. In mid-February 2024, the mystery DNA was uploaded to GetMatch. Within days, there were hits, distant ones, but hits nonetheless. A few third cousins, some fourth cousins. People scattered across the country, sharing small pieces of genetic code with the unknown suspect, none of them knowing how those strands of DNA were about to rewrite a decades-old tragedy. And then, things started to take shape. Cece and her team plunged into the data, charting family trees, connecting marriages, births, and long-lost branches of families that had stretched far and wide. Piece by piece, the web began to close in. What they were about to uncover would shock not just the detectives, but the entire town of Osby. And it might just shock you, too. If you're as caught up in this as I am, go ahead and hit that like button, because this story's about to take a turn no one saw coming. They dug deep, rummaging through census records, obituaries, marriage licenses, military rosters, and anything else that might help map a family's tangled roots. It was painstaking work, the kind that required patience and the ability to chase down 100 dead ends before finding one promising lead. Some branches of the family tree led to people who'd moved across the country decades ago. Others ended with individuals who had already passed away long before 1986. After 6 long weeks, however, a pattern started to take shape. All roads seemed to lead back to northern Oklahoma, around the small towns of Gallery, Enid, and neighboring communities. Whoever had left their DNA on that cardigan wasn't some drifter passing through. This person had ties to the area, deep ones. By late March, the genealogy team had narrowed the search to 3 family lines that fit the profile. Then, focusing on male relatives who would have been between 20 and 50 years old in 1986, they began to zero in on one name that kept surfacing again and again: Robert Allen Keller. When Detective Sarah Mendoza saw that name, she froze. It wasn't new to her. She pulled out the original case file from 1986 and flipped through the old interview notes, the yellowed pages crackling under her fingers. And there he was, age 33, Robert Keller, occupation, worked at the local grain elevator. Residence, just outside Gallery, interviewed October 20th, 1986. Claimed to have been home alone, working on his truck the night Beatrice vanished. Alibi, corroborated by his mother. No physical evidence, no reason to pursue him further. He'd been one of dozens of names on a long list of locals questioned after Beatrice disappeared, and then forgotten. Now, almost 4 decades later, that same Robert Keller, 61 years old today, was still living in the same modest house on the outskirts of town. Still quiet, still unremarkable, still hiding in plain sight. But this time, science had caught up with him. The DNA on Beatrice's cardigan directly indicated someone from his family line. To prove it was Robert himself, they needed to get a direct DNA sample, and to do that, they had to get it without his knowledge. So Mendoza and her team set up surveillance. The plan was simple: a trash pull. Once someone puts their garbage out on the curb, it's considered abandoned property and can legally be collected by police. In the early hours of the morning of April 2nd, 2024, a small team quietly retrieved Keller's trash, well before the sanitation truck arrived. The contents were unremarkable, the sort of stuff people throw away without a second thought. A used coffee cup, tissues, an abandoned razor. Those items were sent to the lab. Then came the hardest part: waiting. Detective Mendoza called Margaret Rowan to inform her they had a promising lead. But she spoke carefully. "Don't get your hopes up just yet," she said gently. Margaret, now 68, had heard those words too many times before. Still, something in Mendoza's voice felt different, steady, hopeful. "I think this might be it," Mendoza told her quietly. "I really think we might have him." 2 weeks later, the call came on April 15th, 2024. The DNA from Keller's discarded coffee cup was a perfect match with the DNA on Beatrice Rowan's torn cardigan. It was him. After 38 long years, they finally had their answer. Detective Mendoza sat in silence, staring at the lab report. Almost 4 decades of unanswered questions, of grief and guilt and quiet determination, seemed to lift all at once. She thought of Dorothy Rowan, who died in 2019 never knowing what had happened to her daughter. She thought of Margaret, who'd spent a lifetime keeping Beatrice's memory alive. And she thought of Beatrice herself, that kind librarian who loved her town, her books, and her community, whose light had been stolen one October evening so long ago. But then there was Robert Keller, the man who had freely been living in that small town all this time, shopping at local stores, nodding to neighbors, blending in, while carrying a terrible secret. Not anymore. She took a deep breath, reached for her phone, and dialed the district attorney's office. It was time to bring Beatrice Rowan home. "We have enough for an arrest warrant," said Detective Sarah Mendoza, her voice calm but charged with years of pent-up determination. "Let's bring him in." 38 years passed before these wheels of justice, rusted and long silent, were finally turning again. March 12th, 2024. 6:47 a.m. The sky above Galway was still ink dark when the arrest team gathered on the edge of town. They stood in a loose circle near their vehicles, their breath misting in the cold morning air as they reviewed the plan one last time. Detective Mendoza had coordinated every detail with the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the local sheriff's department, and the district attorney's office. The warrant was in her hand. Robert Allen Keller is charged with first-degree murder in the death of Beatrice Rowan. The DNA evidence was ironclad, even without a body. Paired with the circumstantial evidence from 1986 and the results of Mendoza's meticulous investigation, prosecutors were confident they finally had enough to make the charge stick. As the first hint of sunlight stretched over the Oklahoma plains, 3 unmarked vehicles rolled quietly down Maple Street toward the modest ranch-style home with its faded blue shutters. It was the same house Robert Keller had lived in for over 40 years. Inside the nearby homes, the early risers felt the motion. Mrs. Patterson, pouring her morning coffee, peered out her kitchen window. Mr. Daniels, on his way to the early shift at the plant, slowed down as he saw the convoy. Officers in tactical vests approached the front door. Scenes like this were almost unheard of in Galway, except, of course, that something unthinkable had happened here 38 years ago. And now at last, justice had come knocking. Detective Mendoza stepped forward and rapped sharply on the door. "Robert Keller, this is the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest. Open the door." A long pause followed, a faint sound of movement inside, then the door slowly creaked open. Standing there was Robert Allen Keller, gray-haired, thin, wrapped in a faded flannel robe and worn slippers. He looked like any other aging small-town man you might pass at the grocery store. His lined face and weary eyes told the story of a life spent blending in. As he looked at the officers, his face didn't reveal any shock or fear, just quiet resignation. It was as if he knew that one day it would come to this. Detective Mendoza said, her tone steady and deliberate, "Robert Allen Keller, you're under arrest for the murder of Beatrice Rowan. You have the right to remain silent." As she read him his Miranda rights, officers moved inside to clear the house. Keller didn't fight, didn't argue. He simply stood there, silent, stoic, almost eerily calm, as handcuffs clicked around his wrists. As he was led out to the waiting car, the neighborhood came alive. Doors opened. Curtains twitched. Neighbors stepped onto their porches in a daze. Bobby Keller, the quiet man from the grain elevator, the man who nodded politely at the hardware store, who cut his lawn every Saturday morning. By noon, the news was spread all over Galway like wildfire. At Della's diner, folks were packed into booths, whispering in incredulous tones. Forks stopped in midair as conversations turned from gossip to shock. It wasn't some nameless drifter, not some passing stranger from out of state. It was one of their own. Robert Keller was born and raised in Galway. His father was a farmer, his mother a schoolteacher. Quiet, polite, forgettable. He'd gone through the Galway school system, worked odd jobs until he landed steady work at the grain elevator. Never married, no kids. Lived with his mother until she died in 2003, then stayed in that same small house alone ever since. People remembered him as ordinary. You'd see him at the hardware store or the gas station, said one longtime resident to reporters. He'd nod, maybe say hello, then just move along. Never caused trouble. I never would have thought. But Detective Mendoza's reinvestigation revealed a darker side to that ordinariness. As it would happen, Robert Keller was a regular visitor at the Gorey Public Library in 1986. Several witnesses from the case testified to that fact. He'd been there often, quietly watching, waiting. And one of the librarians he seemed to pay particular attention to was Beatrice Rowan. It would always seem that whenever Beatrice was working at the library, Robert Keller would appear as if on cue. He'd come in, quietly check out books, mostly westerns and local history, but nobody thought reading was the point. He'd take a table at a place where he could see the front desk, and her. One former library volunteer, interviewed again in 2024, remembered something that hadn't seemed important at the time. He'd always sit where he could see Beatrice, she said. I remember thinking it was kind of odd, but I figured maybe he just liked watching her work. She was so organized, so calm. I didn't think it was predatory. In 1986, Keller had been questioned simply because he was a regular at the library. Asked where he'd been the night Beatrice vanished, he told investigators he was home in his garage working on his truck. His mother, who lived in the house, confirmed she'd heard him out there. She hadn't actually seen him, but she'd had no reason to doubt her son. It was not much of an alibi. But still, without physical evidence or witnesses to place him at the scene, investigators had nothing to go on. So they'd moved on, leaving Keller's name buried in the case file for nearly 4 decades. Now everything had changed. DNA from Beatrice's torn cardigan, his DNA, placed Keller at the scene of her final moments. That discovery allowed detectives to reconstruct what likely happened that night, piece by chilling piece. It is believed that Robert Keller had become obsessed with Beatrice Rowan. He had watched her for months, studying her routines. He knew when she would open the library, when she would close it up, and most importantly, that she was often the last person to leave. On the evening of the 14th of October in 1986, he waited, probably in his truck, parked where it wouldn't draw attention. When Beatrice locked the library doors around 6:30 p.m., she walked to her car, likely tired but content after another day of helping her community. That's when Keller approached her. What he said at that moment, what excuse or question he used to get close, may never be known, but something turned violent. Maybe she rejected him again. Maybe she recognized fear in his eyes too late. Maybe she tried to run. Whatever happened, he forced her into his truck and drove her out to the wooded area about 3 miles from town, a place he knew well, growing up nearby. What happened next, investigators could only piece together from the torn clothing, the scattered belongings, and the trail through the underbrush. There was a struggle. Beatrice fought hard. At some point, Keller overpowered her. Then, trying to cover his tracks, he scattered her things in the woods to stage a false trail, as if she'd run off or been taken by someone else. Afterward, he drove her car back to the library, parked it neatly, locked it, and walked home. He probably told his mother he was finished in the truck and went to bed as if nothing had happened. And when the sun rose and the town discovered that Beatrice was missing, he played the part of a concerned neighbor. He stood beside others, pretending to share their confusion and worry. He attended vigils. He even went to the funeral service held in 1990, though no body had ever been found, standing quietly in the back of the church like any other mourner, all while carrying the weight of what he'd done. For 38 years, Keller lived among the people whose hearts he'd shattered, watching them search, grieve, and remember. Watching Dorothy Rowan cling to hope, watching Margaret Rowan lead vigils year after year. And through it all, he said nothing. The question that haunted Gorey now wasn't just how he'd done it, but how he'd lived with himself afterward. How do you sit across from your neighbors at the diner, knowing what you've stolen from them? How do you smile at the people whose pain you caused? But Keller wasn't offering answers, not yet. The interrogation room at the OSBI field office in Enid was a small, windowless, and deliberately stark affair. A metal table, 3 chairs, and, in the corner, a camera humming softly. Robert Keller sat on one side, still wearing the jeans and plain gray t-shirt the officers had given him following the arrest. His hands were folded neatly, his face unreadable. Across from him, Detective Sarah Mendoza sat with a thick folder in front of her, the weight of 38 years of investigation resting on the table between them. Sitting beside Detective Mendoza that day was Agent Tom Richardson, one of the best interrogators in the business, with over 3 decades of experience. He was composed and steady, being the kind of man who, when blinking, could read the heartbeat of a suspect. "Robert, you know why you're here," Mendoza said, her voice firm yet controlled. "We have DNA evidence placing you at the scene. Your DNA was on Beatrice Rowan's cardigan, the one she wore the night she disappeared, the same one torn from her body in those woods. We know you were there. We know what you did." Keller stared down at the table, silent. His fingers twitched just once. "This is your chance to tell your side of the story," she continued. Agent Richardson leaned forward, and his voice was lower, almost coaxing. "Help us understand, Robert. Was it an accident? Did something go wrong? Did she say something that pushed you over the edge?" Still, Keller said nothing. His jaw tightened, a muscle pulsing in his cheek. "Her family deserves answers," Mendoza pressed gently. "Her mother went to her grave not knowing what happened to her daughter. Her sister's been searching for nearly 40 years. You can end that pain. You can tell us where Beatrice is." For the first time, Keller looked up. His eyes met Mendoza's. There was no sorrow there, only calculation. He was thinking, weighing his words like someone measuring the cost of every syllable. Finally, in a voice rough from years of disuse, he said, "I want a lawyer." Just like that, it was over. The interrogation had barely started when it was over. Keller was booked into Garfield County Jail on a charge of first-degree murder. His bail was set at $2 million, a sum he'd never come close to affording. So he remained behind bars, waiting. When it broke, the story hit Oklahoma like a thunderclap, and soon after, the entire nation. Cold case solved after 38 years. DNA evidence leads to arrest in 1986 disappearance. The headlines were everywhere. National crime shows picked it up. Dateline, 48 Hours, and the true crime podcasts scrambled for interviews. 3 days after the arrest, Margaret Rowan stood before reporters outside of the Golry Public Library, the same place her sister had loved and worked until that October evening in 1986. "For 38 years," she said, her voice steady but trembling in a sea of emotion, "our family has lived with a hole that could never be filled. My mother died without answers. My father died without answers. But today, we finally know the truth. We know who took Beatrice from us." She paused, wiping tears she didn't bother to hide. "Nothing can bring her back, but knowing that justice is finally being served gives us a measure of peace we haven't felt in decades." She then looked straight into the cameras, her gaze sharp and resolute. "To anyone still living with an unsolved case, still waiting for answers, don't give up. Technology is advancing, investigators are still fighting, and your truth might be closer than you think." The legal process moved along a lot faster than anyone had anticipated. Keller's court-appointed attorney, James Hartley, was a worn but capable public defender faced with an impossible task. The DNA evidence was bulletproof. The odds against it belonging to anyone else were 1 in 47 trillion. Still, Hartley did what defense attorneys are trained to do: find cracks, however small, in the prosecution's wall. The biggest challenge for the state? No body. Without Beatrice's remains or a confirmed cause of death, Hartley argued that she could still, technically, be alive, or that Keller's DNA had been transferred to her cardigan in some innocent way. Maybe he'd helped her carry books or boxes once. Maybe she'd brushed past him. It was a thin defense, and every person in the courtroom knew it. But sometimes that sliver of doubt is all a lawyer needs to plant. District Attorney Patricia Gomez, however, was confident. "We've prosecuted murder cases without a body before," she said to the assembled reporters. "The DNA, the circumstances of her disappearance, the location of the torn clothing, and Keller's connection to the victim paint a clear picture. Robert Keller murdered Beatrice Rowan in October 1986, and we will prove that beyond a reasonable doubt." As the preliminary hearings got underway, investigators uncovered even more disturbing details. They searched the house of Keller and found a locked box hidden in his bedroom closet. Inside were carefully preserved newspaper clippings about Beatrice's disappearance, yellowed pages from 1986 and 1987, and later anniversary articles spanning decades. Each one carefully cut, smoothed, and stored, a shrine of obsession right in plain sight. He'd kept them all, a grim, almost obsessive archive of his own crime. Every yellowed clipping, every front-page headline, every anniversary article about the case he thought he'd gotten away with. Together, they formed a macabre scrapbook, a dark diary, documenting not just the murder of Beatrice Rowan, but also the decades the world spent searching for answers he already knew. And there was more. Investigators found photographs not of Beatrice herself, but of the library taken from different angles. A few were unmistakably shot through the windshield of a car parked in the lot. The photo envelopes were dated from 1985 to early 1986, proof that he'd been watching her for months before that October night. The prosecution added the photos and clippings to their growing list of evidence. They painted a damning picture. This wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was planned. It was the work of a man who'd become consumed by obsession and driven by control. Keller's attorney tried to suppress some of the items, claiming they were prejudicial. The judge disagreed and allowed most of them in. The trial was officially set for September 2024. With summer settling over Golry, the town still stood in stunned awe. For almost 4 decades, people had whispered and speculated and mourned. Now they had an answer, and that answer was staring back at them from behind bars. The toughest thing to learn was that evil doesn't always come with a monster's face. Sometimes it resembles your quiet neighbor. Sometimes it waves hello as you pass on your morning walk. Sometimes it lives just 2 houses down, mowing its lawn and paying its taxes while hiding something unthinkable. And sometimes it takes 40 years for justice to catch up. But when it does, it's relentless. Beatrice Rowan's life was taken when she was only 32 years old. She had been a daughter who called her mother every Sunday, a sister who never missed a birthday, and a librarian who remembered every child's favorite book. She wasn't just another victim in a file. She was part of the fabric that is Golry. Her absence left a void that nobody could fill. Her mother died never to know what had happened to her daughter. Her father went to his grave still wondering whether Beatrice had been afraid in those final moments, or if she'd known that people loved her and were searching for her. Yet Margaret Rowan would never give up fighting on behalf of her sister, penning letters, calling detectives, pushing for new leads, and keeping her sister's name alive in local papers and annual vigils. Because of her persistence, and because of modern science and investigators like Detective Sarah Mendoza, who refused to let cold cases stay cold, justice finally found its way to Golry. The arrest of Robert Keller sent shockwaves throughout the community. But as that initial shock began to wear off, something else began to take its place. Closure. The mystery that had shadowed the town for nearly 4 decades finally had an ending. It wasn't the ending anyone wanted, but it was the truth. And the truth, even when painful, has a way of setting people free. But this case also underlined one thing forcefully: the astonishing reach of modern forensic technology. DNA that couldn't be processed back in 1986 was the key to unlocking the truth in 2024. Genetic genealogy, something that didn't even exist when Beatrice disappeared, identified her killer when traditional police work could not. Thousands of families across the United States are still waiting for this same kind of breakthrough. Thousands of cold cases are being reopened, re-examined, and finally solved. Because time doesn't erase evidence, and it doesn't erase guilt. As of now, Robert Keller remains behind bars while awaiting trial. His attorney has hinted at a plea deal, but prosecutors say they're ready to go to court if needed. One thing, however, still remains a mystery: where Beatrice's remains are. Keller hasn't cooperated. Searches of his old properties have turned up nothing. But Margaret says she's made peace with that uncertainty. For so long, she told a reporter recently, we lived in this terrible limbo. Not knowing was its own kind of torture. But now we know who took her from us. We know she didn't just disappear. We know she fought. And we know that man will finally face justice. That matters, and it matters so much if Beatrice's story moved you. If it reminded you of the power of persistence and justice, please share this video. And in the comments, tell me, which other cold cases would you like me to cover next? Follow Revealed Crime Cases on Subscribe for more true stories that matter. Because Beatrice Rowan's story did not turn out quite as anyone wished, but after 38 years of silence, her voice was finally heard, and justice, though delayed, finally arrived.